There is only one nation on earth capable of rallying and bringing together the free people on this planet to stand up to the spread of totalitarianism. There is only one nation on earth that can do that, and that is ours. The United Nations cannot do this. In fact, they cannot do anything.
Daniel Hannan is no stranger to Sun News. He's been on the network many times. He's a Conservative member of the European Parliament from Britain. He's also the author of a new book, Inventing Freedom. Let's start there rather than talking about your message for Americans, because I'm guessing part of the book is the message for Americans.
Well, and for all English-speaking peoples, we've achieved huge things together. The values that we call Western, right? Freedom and free contract, democracy, regular elections, habeas corpus, jury trials, and so on. If we're honest, we're being polite. I mean, they became Western values bluntly because of a series of military victories by the English-speaking peoples. And so it's worth exploring how they came about and what you have to do to keep them.
It always amazes me, whether we're talking about Britain or Canada or America, but we want to be more like the rest of the world. The rest of the world moved to these places because they wanted the freedom that you're talking about.
Right, and Canada, like the US, has been a fantastic example of how you can take people from every continent and every archipelago and turn them into people who believe in liberty and property and individualism and the elevation of the rule of law, simply by getting the institutional structure right. The first thing, whenever you make this argument, people who can't be bothered to engage will say, oh, it's racist, it's nostalgic, it's triumphalist, it's smug. It couldn't be further from the truth. There is nothing ethnic about the Anglosphere. This is a cultural union of values. It's why Bermuda isn't Haiti. It's why Singapore isn't Indonesia. It's why Hong Kong isn't China. You get the institutions right, and freedom will take root anywhere.
And you say that if you make the argument, or I do, that we're denounced as racist, yet Tariq Fatah, one of our columnists, Pakistani, he calls himself an Indian at heart, born in Pakistan, left-winger to the core, argues that exactly what you're saying, that whether you're left or right, you have to support the basic foundations of freedom that the English-speaking world brought about. And I think that it's primarily the left that has lost it. I don't think conservatives are always on the ball, but I think the left is for some reason deciding that this is old news that we can toss out.
Well, I don't think the Anglosphere is old news. I think it's a hugely relevant, pertinent concept. Actually, there's another Indian writer, Madhav Das Nalapat, who has a lovely phrase. He says, the Anglosphere isn't about the blood of the body, it's about the blood of the mind. If you have the shared belief in personal liberty, in residual freedoms, the rights of Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution and so on, that applies everywhere. Actually, I think the orientation of India, funnily enough, Brian, is the key geopolitical question of this century. If India comes to self-identify primarily as an Anglosphere democracy rather than primarily as an Asian superpower, suddenly the world looks a lot warmer and brighter. And I'm cautiously optimistic.
And that'd be good for the rest of Asia.
It would be good for everybody, right? I mean, there's a fifth of humanity there. And so far, the system is working pretty well. The army doesn't get involved in politics. Elections are free and fair. The law, which is the really key one, the law is a mechanism open to the individual seeking redress rather than being an instrument of state control. I mean, India did what all newly independent countries do at first, which was to distinguish itself from the colonial period by doing things differently, almost for the sake of it. So it for decades went down this road of equidistance between Washington and Moscow, self-reliance, Swadesh, Swadeshi, promotion of the Hindi language as the unified. All of that's gone now. India now is much more conscious of itself as a liberal democracy with property rights and security of contract. It's got all the makings of a good Anglosphere working system. And I think, we don't really talk about India joining the Anglosphere. They'd be 2/3 of the population, so it's kind of a slightly different relationship. But if we get that relationship right, it was one that George Bush worked out very hard, and it's one that now Stephen Harper and David Cameron and others have taken up. Obama, sadly, has slightly let it be neglected. If we get that relationship right, then the community of free English-speaking peoples could continue to exert a benign pull on the human species for the rest of the century.
Well, I want to ask you about the threats at home within the Anglosphere, though, and I'm thinking primarily about the administrative state, and I spoke at length with Mark Stein about this last week, the regulatory burden here in America, the regulations, the decision-making powers that bureaucrats have in Canada, and don't even get me started on the EU, or perhaps I shouldn't get you started on the EU, is that not a great threat to our freedom? People don't see it as that, but having armies of bureaucrats running around running our lives is not good for that freedom.
I couldn't agree more. An authoritarian system can exist through an apparently benign bureaucracy. It doesn't necessarily require shiny boots and uniforms and sashes and silly sunglasses. But when you say don't get me started on Europe, it's always important to remember relativity, right? I've noticed with all conservative friends, we always think that things are uniquely bad in our own country. And we always say that it's worse than anybody realizes. If you worked where I do in the European Parliament, you would realize that things are a lot better in the Anglosphere than in most of the Western world, let alone, I mean, you know, in France, you can't show a movie on television on a Wednesday because you're supposed to encourage people to go to the cinema. In Sweden, they are trying to ban advertising aimed, and in fact, have passed some laws to ban all advertising aimed at children. You know, we think we have an intrusive state, but believe me, a system like ours, which assumes residual freedoms, where if something isn't expressly prohibited, you can do it, we're starting from a much, much better place than Europe is.
Okay, but how do we make sure that we don't allow that creeping to continue? How do we continue to push for the freedom that you say we invented?
Well, I'm optimistic because, okay, bureaucrats always extend their powers. That's just what happens, right? Dogs bark and cows moo and international technocracies extend their jurisdiction. That's just how it is. But here's the really good news. Entrepreneurs are always several steps in front of government bureaucrats, which is why, other things being equal, the economy will grow. Because even though the state is growing in absolute terms, if the private sector is growing faster, then the state shrinks in relative terms, and it ends up like one of those ruined Indian temples with the spray of green choking it up. That's free enterprise. It's stronger than any of those paving slabs.
All right, Daniel, thanks so much. Daniel Hannan, you can pick up his book, Inventing Freedom, available at all good bookstores, I'm assuming.